This morning I'm reading from Matthew chapter 18, verses 18 through 35. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say unto you, that if two of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it shall be done for them for my Father which is in heaven. For where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Then came Peter to him, and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times? Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king, which would take account of his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. But forasmuch as he had not to pay, his Lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife and children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. Then the Lord of that servant was moved with compassion, and loosed him and forgave him the debt. But the same servant went out, and found one of his fellow servants which owed him 100 pence, and he laid hands on him, and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me that thou owest. And his fellow servant fell down at his feet, and besought him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. And he would not, but went and cast him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were very sorry, and came and told unto their Lord all that was done. Then his Lord, after that he had called him, said unto him, O thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt, because thou desiredst me. Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on the fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? And his Lord was wroth, and delivered him to the tormentors, till he should pay all that was due unto him. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses. This is the word of the Lord.
They did ask me, I guess they forgot to in time to tell Mike, but just one other announcement, that they would like to plan a men's meeting sometime, I think in the fall is kind of when they're thinking. So those of you men that would like to attend such a thing, it'd be for youth and men. Get with us in Mattermost, and let's try to think about when's a good time for everyone, where it doesn't, we'd like for everyone that possibly can go, do it. We're thinking of doing maybe like a Friday night and Saturday type of thing. Go to maybe LBJ, or LBJ Lake or something, and do something like that, maybe on the lake. Look at your schedule and let us know on Mattermost. Say, hey, these are the dates that best work for me, and let's see if we can't figure out a good time when we can do a men's retreat. All right? All right, so we started talking about forgiveness within the context of how we look at Christianity in this modern post-Christian world, where we have a very different vocabulary, a very different set of presuppositions. And so we're trying to look at the same doctrines that have been preached for 2,000 years, but looking at them within the viewpoint of how your children, and probably for certain your grandchildren, are going to be really looking at these things. Because I think we need to have a good understanding of, because I know you and I, if you grew up in a Christian home the way I did, well, you have a certain way, a certain vocabulary you use when you discuss Christian doctrine. You have a way of looking at it, and it makes perfect sense to you, and you think, well, that's the biblical way. But there's a lot of people that didn't grow up that way, and their vocabulary is very different. And when you say Christian words, they're understanding something very different. And one of those that we're looking at is forgiveness, the topic of forgiveness. We're actually going to be, over the next several weeks, looking at different aspects of it, because I do believe that forgiveness is the core tenet of Christianity. It really is. Not just us forgiving each other and forgiving others, but God forgiving us. That's what Christianity is all about. That. And we talked last or 2 weeks ago, or however it was, when we first dealt with this, and I went through how Christianity is the only religion that has a view of forgiveness. I know they use the word, but when you look at what they mean by that word, it's not what Christians understand by forgiveness. Judaism, the Old Testament, there's not a mention of forgiving people in the Old Testament. God forgives, but people don't forgive each other. And that's not just some oversight. If you go back and read the rabbinical literature, even as far as Maimonides, which was the 12th century, Jews do not have an understanding of forgiveness the way Christians do. There's a book I just read by a Jewish apologist. The name of the book is Judaism is a Religion of Love. And he tries to make the case, a whole chapter he dedicates to making the case that there's no daylight between the teaching of Jesus on forgiveness and the teaching of the rabbis. And yet, even in the argument he makes, and you should read it and you can be the judge for it yourself, but I read his book and I read that chapter, and even when he's trying to teach that there's no daylight between what Jesus taught, for instance, in the text today, and what Judaism teaches, and how he expresses it, you could drive a freight train through the difference between these two things. It's monumental, the difference between Christian forgiveness and Jewish forgiveness. It's just huge. And it's because we're coming at it from very different fundamental approaches. And the same way goes with paganism. Pagans had no sense of what we think of as forgiveness. The pagan forgiveness is a lot more like what we think of forgiveness today if you're coming at it from a modernist worldview. So if you have a materialist worldview, then you're going to think of forgiveness very much along the lines as like Aristotle and Plato and the classical Greek authors. That's going to be your perspective. It may not be where you may not consciously say, well, I read Plato and that's... I realize most of us don't do that, but when you examine what we think of forgiveness, how do we think of forgiveness today? Today we think of forgiveness as therapeutic, cathartic, something that we do for ourselves, not for anyone else. And that's the way the ancients thought about it. That's the way Judaism largely teaches it. You forgive others because, for instance, Maimonides would say that you forgive others because it's actually detrimental to your health to keep bitterness. Does that sound like whatever you would hear from a therapist today? You need to forgive to let go of your anger. You need to forgive, to let go of your bitterness, so that you can live a more fulfilled, flourishing life. It's for you. It's for you. And I'm not arguing that it would be great to let go of anger and bitterness. They are absolutely right that bitterness is not good. Right? Bitterness is the poison that kills the perpetrator, is the saying. Bitterness is the poison that kills the perpetrator, not the victim. So yes, bitterness is bad. It's bad for you as a Christian. It's bad for you as a human being. You need to figure out a way to deal with that. You need to figure out a way to deal with your anger, your resentment. These things aren't good, and there's a lot in the Bible about those also. But forgiveness is not one of them. Forgiveness is not a therapeutic strategy to overcome your resentment. And so that's the difference between the Christian view of forgiveness and all other worldviews and religious views. They're all different. There's a lot of things where there's a lot of overlap. Christianity is not unique in every single way, as sometimes online apologists would want to try to make it out. There's a tremendous amount of overlap. C.S. Lewis has a great line in Mere Christianity where he explains that when you look at pagan religions and false religions, you should expect to find a great deal of truth. You should expect to find in pagan religions, false worldviews, a great deal of truth. because we're all interacting with the same reality. Now, there's going to be error, and the devil's in those details. However, Christianity is not unique in every way. But as far as I can find, and I've read a great deal on this, I can't find any worldview, ancient or modern, that comes close to what Christ is teaching on forgiveness. Now, I want to be very clear because this might come across the wrong way. I am not trying to argue that Jesus stands in opposition to Moses or the Mosaic Law. That is not what I'm saying. It could sound like that somehow I'm saying that Jesus started a new religion and he abandoned Judaism, and that is not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that Jews under Mosaic law did not understand forgiveness. They didn't understand a lot of things. Because Jesus came not to topple Jewish religion, but he came as the fulfillment of its promise. The fulfillment of its promise. That's who Jesus came as. He came to deliver everything that Judaism was expecting and much, much more. Now, what he delivered wasn't what they were thinking in their minds they were going to get, just like with you and I. If you have put your confidence in Jesus Christ, then you have found that what he has done in your life isn't what you probably expected he was going to do. But like Paul says, he's done exceedingly abundantly above all we ask and think. So it's not the same, but it's not worse. So Judaism had a certain expectation. They wanted a Messiah. They wanted life. They wanted justice to run like waters, like the prophet says. And that all happened, but in a way that they weren't expecting at all. And one of those things they weren't expecting was this teaching on forgiveness. We see it in the reaction of the crowd and especially of the disciples. His own disciples, who had walked with him already for quite a while, had already heard him teach incredibly controversial subjects. When Jesus starts teaching on forgiveness, they are highly offended. Highly offended. They did not like his teaching on forgiveness. And you know what I have found in myself, personally, and in everyone I've ever dealt with this subject on? None of us like his teaching on forgiveness. Nobody does. One good way to know whether or not you have embraced or you have been willing to accept, I should say, the teaching of Jesus on forgiveness is if it doesn't offend you, it isn't his teaching on forgiveness. I have been researching this for a long time. I've been teaching it for decades. And it still offends me every time I read it. There's something offensive about how Jesus teaches on forgiveness. Now, to be clear, that's my problem, my fault. I'm not casting aspersion on Jesus. His teaching is incredible. I'm just don't like it. I don't like it. And I think that if you really love forgiveness, you really like it, you think it's wonderful, I don't think you've understood what he has said. Because when Peter heard it, he was taken aback. He was taken aback. So, the Bible talks about forgiveness as being power. There's one of the most creative thinkers in human history, and certainly in the Bible, is David, especially when it comes to matters of sin and forgiveness. Probably because he had such close experience with those things, right? So David had. We're not going to get into them. I don't want to get distracted. But there's just like I have like a little list, a running list I keep of these very crazy, insightful things that David says about salvation that just like are mind blowing. And one of those things is in Psalm 130. He writes about God. He says, if the Lord should mark iniquities, if he would keep tabs on what we do wrong, then nobody could stand before him, right? Nobody would dare even approach God if you really thought he was really keeping track of what you're doing. That's what David is saying, which is true. But that's not that's just common sense. But this is what he says after that. But he says, but there is forgiveness with God, so that he might be feared. So, what is your understanding of forgiveness? When you think of God and God's forgiveness, is the first thing that comes to your mind is, boy, that's scary. It isn't, right? It's not. We think of that as the antidote to fear. Like if God would be more forgiving, we would all be less fearful. But that's not how David looked at forgiveness. So David is looking at something that he is calling forgiveness that for him is terrifying. It's terrifying. And the reason it's terrifying, one reason is because it is such what we could call raw, unbridled power. The power to forgive is, and this is where Christianity is so unique, and this is what we find in Jesus, in the apostles, and in the church. And if you look at church history and how this played out across especially the persecution by the Roman Empire on 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century Christians, and you see how they took the teaching of Jesus that we just had read to us, and they enacted that in their life, and the way it just shook the Roman Empire right to its core. It's one of the things, even atheist historians and sociologists can't understand. They puzzle over how it was that the Roman Empire, in the course of only about 300 years, went from having 50 Christians to being so overwhelmingly Christian that you couldn't be emperor and not be a Christian. Just dramatic upheaval, one like we can't find anything like it in history. And when Rodney Stark, who was at the time an agnostic sociologist, analyzes this in his book, The Rise of Christianity, he points out a number of different things that you can look at and attribute, humanly speaking, say, this could be why Christians were so influential in the empire. And every one of those basically comes back to this overall attitude of forgiveness. Overall attitude of forgiveness. Tremendous power. There are just so many examples, especially since the time of Christ, recorded examples of how forgiveness can be such powerful. One of them that struck me, I hadn't read this one until recently. I have a whole bunch of these I could give. I'm going to give one I just read recently. It's more new to me. I found it to be so compelling the way this woman explains it. Her name is Eva Moses Kor. So what she is she's a survivor from Auschwitz. She was one of the identical twins in Dr. Mengele's, we hate to even call him doctor, in Mengele's, all his hideous, monstrous experimentations he did on identical twins. If you're not aware of that, you should go. I'm not going to talk about it here, but you can go and read on it. It's absolutely horrifying, the things they did. Well, she and her identical twin were in Auschwitz and were subject to his experiments. She survives. Her sister bore the brunt of, because what he would do is he would divide them up. He liked identical twins because you could experiment on one and see what happened, and then you can compare it to the other as a baseline. And it's like a really exact baseline. And so the twin sister died, even though she survived, she died very young. So this woman lived to be quite old, and she became an advocate for the memory of the Holocaust, especially against those that would deny it happened. So one of the big problems, and it's still today, you get on certain areas of Twitter, you'll fall into a deep, deep rabbit hole of people who have all these arguments why this didn't happen. There was no crematoriums. There was no gas chambers. That door would never work. They got all this stuff. So she was an advocate to try to prove to everyone, give evidence, and silence these people who were saying it didn't happen. And she made it her life's quest to dig up these old German guards who worked at Auschwitz and get them to go on record in affidavits and testimonies of what actually happened there. And she finally got one who was willing to go with her and stand in Auschwitz and walk reporters through the camp and point out where everything had happened and what it was like. Because he was the one whose job was to look through the peepholes of the gas chambers and determine when they could turn off the gas. Everyone was dead. And then he signed the collective death certificate for all the people in there. That was his job. And she got him to go in front of cameras with officials present and journalists present and swear completely against his own best interests, obviously, that this had really happened, and this is the way it was, and this is how these things were built, and these things how they were. That's what she did. While she's involved in getting him to agree to this, she begins to wrestle with her anger, her resentment, and these things. And I realize that this doesn't exactly line up with what I believe is the biblical teaching of forgiveness, but she makes a point that I think is very valid. And that was, she realized that she was going to need to forgive this man. Now, she caught tremendous flack for this. If you've never read Elie Wiesel's book, The Sunflower, right? It's a book where he details how he was brought in as a young Jew in concentration camp into a dying SS soldier's room because he's dying. He wants forgiveness from a Jew, and he simply turned around and left and said, only God can forgive. Some people don't deserve forgiveness, and it certainly isn't my place to speak for the dead. That was Elie Wiesel's response. So there was a lot of Jewish people who were not happy with what she did in forgiving him. And after speaking with a friend and therapist of hers, she realized that not only should she forgive him, but she should forgive Mengele. And this is what she wrote. And this is reading from one article she wrote trying to defend what she did. She wrote a lot. I'm only going to read a small portion. She says, but what I discovered for myself was life-changing. I discovered that I had the power to forgive. That no one could give me that power, and no one could take it away. And then she wrote at the end, this is what she says, and then I said this, and this is her on the grounds of Auschwitz. This German soldier has given his testimony. She presents him with a letter in which she wrote, I forgive you, basically, to him. And she said this to him. She says, in spite of all that, I forgive you. And the idea that even in that strange reality that I was dealing with, the make-believe, that I had the power, and now she's speaking of Mengele, that I had the power even over the angel of death, and there was nothing that he could do to change it. It made me feel very good. Like I said, I don't subscribe to every view that she has. She still has a very Jewish view and a very modern view of forgiveness. But there is a point, I think, where she really hits the nail on the head. And that is that forgiveness is power. It's not weakness. Nietzsche hated forgiveness more than probably any other aspect of Christianity, and he had a long list of things he hated about Christianity. But he hated forgiveness because he believed it was a manipulation of the weak over the powerful. But what we find in the Scripture through David, through Jesus, and through the apostles is the exact opposite. Forgiveness is not a manipulation of the weak over the powerful. Now, we talked last week, and we won't go deeply into it, but I do want to remind you that we did look last week that it can be used for manipulative purposes, and that's wrong, right? To tell a victim, you should just forgive, and therefore the perpetrator suffers no consequences, that's not biblical forgiveness either. And using it that way to manipulate victims into silence is not forgiveness, and it's wrong. But that's not biblical forgiveness. That's not biblical forgiveness. Biblical forgiveness looks a lot more like the young man who participated in the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that kicked off World War I. They tried to kill the Archduke. He threw the bomb that ended up blowing up the car that was following the caravan. They didn't get him, and then through some stroke of really bad luck, the Duke's car stalled right in front of another assassin, and they just shot him like 3 feet away, killed him. And that kicked off World War I, which resulted in World War II. Horrible chain of events. They captured the guy who threw the bomb, and they put him in jail, and the children of the Duke and the Duchess who died, their children, which were the Habsburgs, you can find this in a book called Hitler and the Habsburgs. Great book. But they were Christians, and their priest counseled them to forgive this man. And two of them did, and they wrote him a letter to, his name was Kabrunovich. They wrote him a letter, and they forgave him for killing their parents. And this Jesuit priest delivered it to him, gave it to him in jail. And he says, his testimony was that Kabrunovich sobbed when he heard its contents. And he confessed he was ready to face any punishment because the letter had saved his soul. That looks a lot more like Christian forgiveness. And he did. He died in prison. So Christian forgiveness is not a manipulation. It's real divine power. In fact, you can't forgive without that power. Christians take forgiveness so seriously like this because we take sin so seriously. See, if forgiveness isn't real, if it's just some psychological maneuver or some therapeutic strategy, then what you're saying is that the sin, the offense, really isn't real either. And that fits the modern materialistic worldview. They don't believe that sin is real. Sin is nothing more than guilt or shame, depending on what end of the spectrum of paganism you're on. Those aren't the same things. You have guilt, which would be more along the Christian end of the spectrum, where you feel, just real quick, so let me give you an example of the difference between shame and guilt. If you make a resolution on New Year's that you're going to go to the gym every day, and you don't, you feel guilt. Now, there's no reason why you should. You made a promise to yourself, and you have every right to not keep that promise, because you can just forgive yourself. Right? That's guilt. Shame is what you feel when you dishonor somebody else, like a family member. So in cultures where it's very important that my father or mother not lose face, and I do something that costs them their reputation, then I feel shame. That's right. So you have shame and guilt. And when we think, well, sin is nothing more than shame and or guilt, well, then forgiveness is nothing more than just a manipulation of words. It's just semantics. And that's how the modern man really looks at forgiveness. It's just a semantical tactic. You just say words, and you say them long enough until they're true. You basically try to speak them into existence in yourself. And that's why so many Christians get sucked into this view, believing that forgiveness, I'll give you an example. I'll have people come to me and say, so-and-so, this person, they harmed me. They did something that really offended me. It hurt me deeply. Maybe they stole from me, or maybe they just besmirched me. Maybe they didn't treat me the way I expected. Whatever it is, they offended me. And I realize that Jesus wants me to forgive, so I forgave them. But I'm still very angry and very resentful and very bitter, so I guess I just didn't really forgive them. And I just need to tell me how I can really forgive them so I don't have to feel this way anymore. See, that's not taking sin seriously. You're taking sin as just being some subjective feeling that you have about a situation. And that you're now trying to use forgiveness, as we call it, as a ploy to somehow make that just go away in your mind. It's like I want targeted amnesia. It's like a pill. If I could just take a pill that would make me not hate you anymore, that would be wonderful. The problem is, whether I hate you or whether I'm bitter against you or resentful against you or whatever it is, whatever feeling I have towards you, that doesn't actually reflect reality. Christians believe in a concept called sin, which is the spiritual reality that surrounds wrongdoing. So sin isn't just some construct, some societal construct that we've put together to make people in society behave in a civilized manner. That's not what sin is. That's shame and guilt. Shame and guilt, which can or cannot be connected to sin. Sin is an actual deficit in God's eyes on your account. Jesus, now you have to understand when you read the parables, even the parables of Jesus, these are highly compressed models, if you will. Mike's going to love that word. He perks right up whenever I say it. He likes it. They're highly compressed cartoon versions. And I don't mean that to disparage them. We don't look at the parables and pull out every minute detail as doctrine. We're looking at the overall picture, the overall point that's being made. Now I want you to notice what parable Jesus uses here, what illustration or metaphor he uses to explain what sin is like. So sin is like a debt. Now a debt has nothing to do with how you feel. I got a letter, or my business got a letter a while back from the IRS that said I owed X amount of dollars for a period of payroll. I opened that up and said, this must not be true. Because I searched deep within my feelings, and I didn't feel like I owed any money. And then I got a letter from the bank that said, you don't have any money in the account. And I knew that wasn't true, because when I went to the store with the feeling that I was very wealthy and could buy whatever I wanted. We all know these things don't work that way, right? Sin doesn't work that way either. You're not a sinner because you feel like a sinner. And fixing the feelings doesn't fix the sin. Forgiveness fixes the sin. That's the power of forgiveness. It's the power. It doesn't fix the feelings. So you say, Daniel, he always criticizes me. And he criticized me the other day, and I just forgave him. But I'm still very angry at him. So I must not have forgiven him. I must still be holding it against him. That's actually not true. If you forgive somebody, regardless of how you feel about it later, they're forgiven. Jesus said, whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. If you go down and you sign an affidavit, if somebody owes you money and you go down and you sign an affidavit in the court and say, I forgive this, I absolve that debt. They no longer owe me. Regardless of how you feel about it, the next hour or the next day or the next month, that debt is liquidated. It's liquidated. It has nothing to do with how you feel. That's the power of forgiveness. When God forgives, you think God forgives because he doesn't want to feel bitter against you anymore? Is he trying to cope with his resentment? That's not how it works at all. It's not how it works our way. In fact, what the parable teaches us, and this is, I think, very interesting. What the parable teaches us is that the power that we have to forgive sins is a direct result of being forgiven. See, that's what the parable is saying. The man, you have two, right? You have the king who's owed a huge debt by, we'll call him John Doe. And then you have Jane Doe who owes John Doe a very small debt. So John owes the king massive amount of money, $3 trillion or whatever it works out to, if you put it in today's currency. And Jane owes John about $100. John can't forgive Jane. This is why we don't find forgiveness in the Old Testament. John can't forgive Jane because he owes too much money. Think about it this way. If I owed you money, say I owe you $1,000, and I haven't paid you, and I'm in arrears, I'm behind in my payments, and my wife, or that wouldn't be a good example, Kelly owes me $100. Well, I can't forgive her $100 because it's not mine. Anything I'm owed actually belongs to you. So I can't just go and say, hey, out of the goodness of my heart, I'm going to forgive you. You actually have to be able to be able to absorb the debt that's owed. Right? It has to be paid one way or another. It gets paid. When the king forgave the man who owed that massive amount of debt, what he was saying is, I'm going to absorb your debt. I'm paying it. Now you don't owe it. Well, that's wonderful. Now we all love that, especially when we connect the dots and go, the king is like God, and I'm the guy who owed all the money. Now if you can connect those dots, you're way ahead of the crowd because most people aren't connecting those dots. So that's great. You're like, whoa, well, that's wonderful. Like, wow, I love forgiveness. There's nothing scary about it. It's wonderful, wonderful. All my debt, yeah, okay, great. Now, this is what the king is actually now doing. Right? He's conscripting you. He is putting upon you a corresponding amount of responsibility to go out and forgive others. So when you don't forgive, then you're defrauding. You Christian, speaking to us sitting right here today, don't worry about the materialists and the naturalists and the pagans. Don't worry about them. Let them worry about themselves. Let's worry about us right now. When you and I hold a grudge against someone and say, I won't forgive them, you're defrauding the God who forgave you. Because his forgiveness was a payment, or was an investment, I should say, into you to empower you, to give you the wherewithal to be able to forgive. Why would God forgive you? Why? What gain is there? Except that God really likes forgiveness. And you can't forgive anybody in your natural state. You're too much in debt with your own sin to be able to forgive anybody. And that's why we find that where there is no forgiveness of God, for instance, now going back to the materialist worldview or the postmodern worldview, where you say, well, they don't you know what cancel culture is? It's very interesting. Cancel culture. So the postmodernism has recreated Christianity. Right? They have their own rituals, they have their own sacrifices, they have their own priests. They have all, I know they don't call them those things, they don't think of them in religious terms, but if you analyze, let's just say like woke culture is just one element of it, one sliver of this post-Christian thought. When you analyze it, you realize they're just replicating Christianity. Even raging atheists like Richard Dawkins have acknowledged that Christianity was a much better worldview than any other. He just came out in an interview. You haven't seen it. You can go online and find it. It's everywhere. So they're recreating Christianity. And a lot of things aren't hard to recreate. They have their own little churches. They have their own little congregations. They have their own dogmas, their own doctrines. You know what they can't recreate? Forgiveness. That's why there is none. There is none. If you violate the commandments of postmodernism, whatever those happen to be at the moment, and you acknowledge it, like we've seen across the social media and you've seen on television even, right? They do something that is it could be wrong for Christians too, but for post-Christianity, it's certainly wrong. And everyone says, no, that's wrong. You're evil. You're bad. You're well, they don't use sin, right? You're a phobe. You're a whatever, homophobe, or that's their word for sin. Okay, fine. So, you're this sinner. And so the person humiliates themselves, or humbles themselves, I should say. And they say, yes, you're right. I was totally out of place. I was wrong. Doesn't matter. You're canceled. You're canceled. There's no coming back. You don't get to come back from that because they don't have forgiveness. It doesn't exist. How are they going to do it? They can say, we forgive you, but they can't. And they don't. Because it takes actual real power to forgive. You can't just use the words. The words don't have power in them. There has to be something objective that stands behind that. So if I write you a check, and give you an illustration. If I write you a check, and I write it for $1 trillion, and I sign it, you understand that isn't worth anything, right? I hope you understand, because if you don't, then I'll buy everything you have today. You know why it's not worth anything? Because the signature I'm going to put on there isn't Elon Musk or the government of the United States. Something that has some value that you can say, look at there. It's for $1 million and it's from, whoever has that amount of money. That's It's the objective value that stands behind the check that makes the check valuable. Forgiveness is not in the words, it's not the vocabulary. It's not in the feelings we feel when we do it. Forgiveness, the power of forgiveness is in the power that stands behind it. And that's why we can't forgive unless we've been forgiven. But once we've been forgiven, we've been conscripted into God's army of forgiveness. And Jesus says, you will forgive. The most stern warnings that Jesus ever issued towards true believers are on the matter of forgiveness. We think that, Jesus was very against adultery, and he was against adultery. But he spoke a lot sterner towards Christians, believers, who don't want to forgive than he did to the woman caught in adultery. We have to take this to heart. We have been forgiven. That's great. And it's real. Your debt has been canceled, liquidated, paid in full. And now you have a power you never had before. And most people in the world don't even understand. You have the power to forgive others. Those who've done you wrong, you can forgive them. Absolve their debt. It won't change the way you feel. It's not going to make you not be bitter or resentful or angry. You probably will forgive that person and still fight anger, resentment, and bitterness for a long time because that's a psychological problem. And there's, things you can work on that, but you're going to feel that way. If somebody, let's say that the offense that you forgive is actual money. Let's say I steal something of value from you and I can't repay it, and you come to me and say, Mike, don't worry about it. You don't owe it to me anymore. I'm even willing to put it in a legal document. It's absolved. Now you say, well, does that mean I'll never look at my driveway where my boat used to be and say, that dirty, no good for nothing stole my boat? Of course you will. Every time you drive up and you think, I want to go fishing, you think, but he stole my boat. Does that mean you didn't forgive me? It doesn't mean that at all. Because forgiveness deals with real things and has real power to do it. There's a great story, excuse me. There's a great story that Philip Yancey tells in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace. If you haven't, I know there's several books you should get if you are interested in this subject. The number one best book on forgiveness, in my opinion, is Timothy Keller's book, Forgive. Fantastic book. You really should get that book and read it. It'll do you a lot of good. Another really good book that isn't about forgiveness but deals with it a lot is Philip Yancey, a long time ago, wrote a book called What's So Amazing About Grace. Now, this is a very easy book. All of you will enjoy this book. If you're a Christian, you will enjoy this. It's super easy read. It's just him talking about how great grace is, right? He has a story in there that really impressed me. And it's back in 1983, right before the Iron Curtain fell. They were starting to soften. Gorbachev was loosening up the Soviet bloc and allowing more, differences. And so they allowed Pope John Paul II to travel to Poland, where he's from. He's Polish. And he held a huge open-air mass. And Poland is like 95 or something like that, 98, maybe at that time 98% Catholic. So it just massive amounts of people came to this mass. And they walked there down the main thoroughfare of Warsaw. And right on the road was the Politburo, the party's main headquarters, that's staffed mostly by non-Poles, Russians. And tremendous horrible things had happened in that building. That's where they tortured people. That's where people disappeared whenever you were a dissenter. And all these people, millions of people, are marching down this road, and they start surrounding that building as they go by it. They walk around it as they go by for a long time. And they're all yelling, yelling, yelling. You know what they're yelling? We forgive you. We forgive you. There was a doctor. His name is Ira Bach. He was in palliative medicine, which means palliative medicine. Sorry, so if you have incurable disease or terminal illness, his job is just try to help improve your quality of life. You can't be healed. It's either incurable and debilitating, or it's terminal. And so his area of medicine is try to make what we would sometimes call hospice, kind of like that. It's part of that. Hospice is part of what he did. Anyways, he did that for like 30 years. Thank you. Thank you. He did that for like 30 years. After about 30 years, he wrote a book called 4 Things That Matter Most. 4 Things That Matter Most. And he says that these are 4 short sentences that carry the core of wisdom of what people who are dying have taught me about what matters most in life. And what he taught his patients was that they should say these things before they died. 4 things that he says most had an effect on his patients who were dying or had incurable disease to make their life better. 4 things. Thank you. I love you. Please forgive me. And I forgive you. Thank you. I love you. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Now, he's not a Christian. And he doesn't explore why half of that is about forgiveness and why there's a power in it. But the Bible does, and Jesus does. The reason why there's a forgiveness and power is because of the cross. Forgiveness always comes in the shape of the cross. Always. It always involves the person doing the forgiving bearing the sin of the person being forgiven. So when I tell you you should forgive people, don't think that I say that nonchalantly or carelessly or flippantly. I understand from personal experience, it is the hardest thing you'll ever do in your life. It is the hardest thing. And the more you know about it and understand it, the harder it's going to get. Like I said in the first one, Jesus is inviting you to his throne, to wear his crown, to share his glory on his right and on his left. He's inviting you up to the cross to die to self, to bear the burdens of the others. And that's what we do when we forgive. There is no more concrete example of what it means to take up your cross. There's no more concrete example of what that means than to forgive somebody. And when you do that, you'll understand the burden of the cross. Let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, I thank you greatly for the example that Jesus set forth for us. That he took upon us all our infirmities, all our transgressions, the weight and guilt of all our sins. He took them to the cross and forgave us. We praise you for forgiveness. Father, we also tremble when we comprehend the responsibility that places on us now. Help us to stand up under the weight of that cross, to bear it with the same joy that Jesus bore his cross. to forgive those who have wronged us so that they can forgive those who have wronged them. So that the revival of forgiveness can be everywhere. We ask these things in the name of Jesus. There's more we're going to say about forgiveness, but if any of you have any questions, I'll be up here in front. I'll be happy to try to explain